In research methods, for example, we could ask questions such as, do the researchers, when we read research, have a potential cultural bias? Is there something about the backdrop of these researchers in terms of their cultural origins or their perspective on the field, their worldview, that might make us want to at least ask, is it possible that they bring a cultural bias to their work? Who are the participants? One of my friends and colleagues, a young man named Aaron Richmond at Metropolitan State University in Denver, Colorado, in the United States, did a study with some of his students 4 or 5 years ago, reviewing the major mainstream teaching of psychology journals. And you would think that if anyone would do a good job of reporting who the research participants are, it should be teachers of psychological science. But he found that in a significant percentage of the studies, researchers did not even report ethnic and other demographic data on the research participants. Sometimes not even the sex of participants. That's an important issue because, as Hein and others have pointed out, too often the research participants probably are not representative of any broader population that would be meaningful to the real world. Are our research instruments linguistically equivalent? For too long, Western psychologists' perspective on cross-cultural psychology was get a sabbatical, fly to an exotic place, administer research tools in their native language, which was most often English, and then report the differences. We know that instruments are not always linguistically equivalent. We know that apparatus, Mike Cole at the University of California in San Diego, for example, did studies showing that people in cultures around the world, sometimes if presented with a problem-solving apparatus from a Western country, simply didn't understand the apparatus, but when an apparatus was contrived that reflected their own cultural experience, they solved problems just as well as English or American people. Thank you very much. Same thing exists with language. Do people respond differently to research instruments? We know, for example, that some cultures on things like a Likert scale will use the extremes on the scale, and other cultures always cluster their responses more toward the middle, toward a modal response, and that can be related to concepts like individualism and collectivism and so forth. When my wife, on one of our sabbaticals in Japan, was teaching English to students at a community college or a technical college, she was shocked at first when she would ask a question to the class, a rhetorical question, or even call on a particular student for an answer. Before replying, they would often consult the students near them and get a consensus before responding. So we have all sorts of cultural differences in terms of how people respond to research questions and research instruments. And there are some common pitfalls that we can see in research. For example, there's a tendency to treat culture as an independent variable. Measure something in 2 or more cultures, find a difference, and attribute the difference to the cultures. When in fact, it may be due to difference in size of cities, it may be due to other differences in the participants that aren't necessarily tied to culture. And of course, we can't assign culture as an independent variable, so we can't ever do a true experiment in the sense that we can prove that culture is in fact the relevant causal variable. We also tend to overgeneralize cultural dimensions. Hofstade's dimensions, for example, it's easy to measure something in an Asian culture and a North American or a Western European culture, find differences and conclude that it's because one group is individualist and the other is collectivist. David Matsumoto published a study some years ago, which he found 17 studies in the literature in which Japanese students seem to be more individualistic than American students. even though the United States is supposed to be the textbook example of individualism, and Japan is often thought of as a textbook example of collectivism. So it's too simple and often too superficial to simply say that differences are due to either culture or cultural dimensions.